I want to bring up DYDX. DYDX has been an example of a product that launched on Ethereum, then moved to its L2 for scalability. And now they announced just a couple of weeks ago that they will launch their app chain on Cosmos after intensive research. So I wanted to hear both of your guys' takes. What do you think is part of their decision making, and what are some of the pros and cons? Maybe Jack, if you want to start.
Yeah, applications, many of which exist out there, especially the more complex ones, need the ability to dip down into the lower layers of the stack to optimize for their specific use cases. And if you're building an order book and a sort of derivatives exchange like what DYDX has, they went out there and they looked at everything and they said, we need the ability to optimize the bottom layers of the stack, and we need a modular framework that enables us to do that. And they found Cosmos, where we've been building this way for years. Celestia is out there pushing this modularity narrative. They're very much a part of Cosmos, and we've been building this way for a long time, which is why Celestia ended up in Cosmos.
And then Kyle, what do you think about the move from DYDX? Do you think it's been a good decision, or is that going to be bad for them in the long run?
Yeah. So I said, I think my original comment that kind of sparked this podcast was the app chain thesis is 98% wrong. So I want to kind of unpack what that 2% is. I think that's kind of, and DYDX is like the kind of centerpiece example of that. I've been asking Cosmos and Polkadot developer type people for years now, you say you want the system to be configurable. And like, okay, that sounds good, but like specifically, what are the variables that people want to configure? And actually, correction, what are the variables that are actually useful to configure? And the responses to that, I've asked that question, I don't know, 50 times to 50 different kind of core developer types over, a several year period. And there's been basically no good answer, other than like sovereignty. Just like, you want to be sovereign for the sake of sovereignty, that's a legitimate answer, and obviously has its place in the world. But assuming you're not optimizing for consensus sovereignty for the sake of consensus sovereignty, there's basically no good answer to that question. The correct answer to that question is go as fast as possible, be as cheap as possible, and support a diversity of programming models that maximize efficiency. And like, that's basically it. And like DAGs versus blockchain data structures are all mechanical details. No one actually gives a shit. Talking about like arbitrary subsidizing storage or like changing gas codes is just like all playing economic games that is not sustainable by definition. So like, I've heard a bunch of these things and I've just found them to be all garbage. The only real application I have seen that like really justifiably may only work by fundamentally modifying consensus is something that looks like DYDX, which is you want to have a limit order book, and you want to have that limit order book live in memory, but not be committed to state updates in the chain. That is some set of trade-offs that they have, right? Like their view is that is the optimal basically design parameters for the system. You cannot do that in Solana or in even Cosmos default. You have to modify Cosmos pretty substantially to get there. Right? And like there's some case that like that is in fact the optimal way to run a decentralized limit order book. If that's in fact the case, then you need that kind of configurability. But basically the only class of application I have seen that actually justifies modifying consensus is basically anything that's DEX related. So Thorchain did this with their, they automated the transaction orders in the per block based on the amount of fees paid, which is very clever. Mangata is doing this in Polkadot land to basically encrypt transactions so you can't have MEV. Osmosis does the same thing. The only people I have actually seen modify consensus for some intelligent reason, other than they want to because they're like intellectually curious, are DEX related applications. And that's kind of inherent to the nature of MEV, and inherent to the nature of trading and like low latency and HFT and all of this kind of adversarial environments that come around trading. So I think I applaud DYDX for like having the courage to get up and move and try something. I think that's a net good experiment that's being run. Exchange is by definition the hardest type of application you can build on the internet because money is involved. It is very low latency, and everyone is fucking demanding highest performance at all times. And there's actually no other class of application that has that high of demand. Every other application, you can relax one of those assumptions, whether it's the money part or the latency part or the performance part or whatever. But like in trading, you cannot relax any of those assumptions, and it's right 24/7. And so there is a case to be made that the optimal DEX should break composability, should not have limit orders on chain, right? Like whatever, like some other, maybe there's some other mechanical trade-offs that they're making changes. I'm not exactly sure. There's some case to be made that to get actually useful DEX performance, you need to do that. I'm not actually convinced that is the case or not, and we'll kind of see over the next couple of years how, let's say, Mango or Fairs versus DYDX. But certainly that is a plausible way that like the physics plays out.
I think, just to sort of zero in on one point you made there just a second ago, sovereignty. It's easy to dismiss this desire for sovereignty and to view it as kind of economically low value. But over and over again, we have users showing up in Cosmos, demanding their own runtimes, demanding their own blockchain. And a lot of that ends up, when you talk to them, it ends up coming down to sovereignty. And, Kyle just really put it well, why exchanges would want that. I think video games are another area where this is going to be increasingly important. That's another low latency, high demand area. I think IoT and sensor data, as well as the ability to sort of monetize that, is another area where this is going to be really important. Things around privacy. So I think that there's many more of these applications out there. And the fact that blockchains haven't been able to tap those markets yet is due to the fact that we haven't sort of scaled to the point where that's possible. And I think right now we're sort of reaching this inflection point with the technology where some of those new applications are possible. And this is why we're seeing an influx of developers into Cosmos and many, many more people excited about the app chain thesis right now.
I want to talk about sovereignty a little bit more. So there are clearly political reasons to want sovereignty. There's also good like long-term economic experimentation reasons to want it as well. In the sense of like, we don't know which runtime is the best or whatever. Like there's other political variables at play. Like, I don't know, should Vitalik be the spiritual leader of crypto, or should it be Anatoly, or should it be Mo? And like, these are weird subjective questions, but actually like a lot of people hold opinions on this fairly strongly, although they won't express them publicly. And
very, very well said, Kyle.
Yeah. So there is real open questions on sovereignty. But one thing, and there's also legitimate reasons for different parties to want to be sovereign, and I fully respect that. The one area I'd push back on is I think most people who claim to want sovereignty are wrong. Not all, but most, like 95%. I think probably, and I think mostly it's a function of either misunderstanding the point of crypto systems or just like wanting control for the sake of wanting control, because like that's just how they're wired. But I generally think that you'd actually, most of these apps, if you really want to maximize credible neutrality of your system in the long run, you should want to actually be on some sort of a shared open ledger. Now, if there's some performance reason why that is implausible given physics, then like that justifies moving elsewhere. And I think DYDX is really the only serious experiment that kind of testing that right now. And I guess but like I haven't really seen any of the others. That doesn't preclude many gaming specific chains from existing. The gaming universe in particular seems to have a pretty strong proclivity to want to control their own chain. There's just something about the culture of video game developers that like leads to that. I don't appreciate the nature of the culture of those firms to understand why and how that is the case, but it clearly is the case.
I have a thesis
and so
as to why that's the case.
It will happen in gaming land specifically for sure, just as a function of like culture.
I think that one of the reasons why that is the case is that a lot of those game developers came out of the Web2 gaming world where they were rugged by platforms repeatedly. And many of those folks said, okay, well, if I'm going to get rugged by Facebook or Google, or, we can all think of like Stadia or Farmville, or, just the list goes on. And this is a major reason to want sovereignty. You want to remove platform risk. And when you use a shared L1, you expose yourself to a significant amount of platform risk. And a lot of times that gets expressed as developers saying things like, well, I just want it because I want to control it. But in reality, what they're looking for is platform independence, and to sort of eliminate these dependencies that might end up tripping them up and slowing them down.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that's what people say, and I understand why they come to that conclusion. I actually think their understanding of the nature of Web3 systems and that specific logical flow is exactly the opposite of reality. I think the way to actually minimize platform risk in the long run is by being on open, shared, permissionless, credibly neutral state and systems, even if that may come with some short-term hiccups. But I actually think in the long run, if you want to be maximally platform independent, you do not want to live in your own island.
So credible neutrality is one I kind of want to dig into a little bit. I would want credible neutrality from the underlying software implementations, i.e. Linux, but I don't necessarily want credible neutrality from the specific Linux implementation I'm using. I want it to be very specific to me. And I think that that's an example of sort of like why developers want these application-specific blockchains is they want well-supported sort of underlying software, but the running of it and the specific implementation, they want control over. And I think we're much more likely to see credible neutrality come in at that level rather than on the individual L1 level, where there's all, as you mentioned, these political concerns that keep popping up over and over again that are kind of messy, that are going to end up sort of describing how the world ends up happening.
It's possible that's the right vector. I'm fairly skeptical. I don't think. I think in an ideal world, no one actually wants to deal with the financial back end. And in fact, the more you deal with the financial back end, the more you're exposing yourself to all kinds of other shit, MSB and who knows what else, like other licenses. And then also just you have to deal with your own validators, your own community, and you have your own fork of the system. Like you increase a lot of overhead for your internal team and for your external comms and messaging by doing that. And again, today there may be some gains from that for sure. As these systems ossify and stabilize, that becomes less and less of the case over time.
Do we ossify and stabilize in a world in which there are many chains and asynchronous composability becomes dominant? Or do we ossify and stabilize in a 2 to 3 platform credible neutrality world? And I think that the short-term vectors are pushing us much more towards ossifying in this asynchronous composability, many chains world. But, that's just the way I see it.
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. Path dependence is one of the most important things to reason about in how the world will play out. Definitely the easiest technical thing in the near term is for everyone to share one L1. That has problems for sure, but it's just easier. There's one indexing and query system, and there's one read write, and you don't have bridges, you don't have all these latency things, and all that other shit just gets more and more complicated. And exchanges are confused, and wallets are confused, and you can solve all these problems, but it's just easiest if everyone reads and writes from the same place, which is why ETH L1 became ETH L1, is precisely for that reason. Therefore, I think the path-dependent way to think through the problem is to maximize that vector and slowly add on other scalability variables as necessary, whether they're side chains or drive chains or supernets or subnets or whatever. There's all kinds of configurations.
Flavor of the month.
Yeah. I'm not really opposed to any particular configuration. I just think it's the easiest thing. It's really obvious. It's the easiest thing in the near term for everyone to live in one place. You will eventually max that out. That's not a question. But we're not even close to maxing that out now. And I don't think we're even close to maxing that out in 2 or 3 years. I think in 6 or 7 or 8 years, we could be maxing that out, but we're not close to it. Just in terms of software optimizations, plus just growth in hardware.
I think it's really easy to look at the ETH L1 thing and say, okay, well, all of these things popped up on ETH L1, therefore that's the way it's going to happen. I think we've seen this progressive wave of more and more chains spinning out in every blockchain cycle. And if we go back and look at it, starting with the original Bitcoin, we had the first shitcoins in 2011, and those folks each spun up their own sort of proof of work consensuses and new forks. We saw this again in 2013, 2014, and then in 2015, that's when we saw Ethereum come. And that was the first sort of shared smart contracting platform. And then in 2017, we saw this explosion of other shared smart contracting platforms. And that was sort of another spin out. And this is where the Cosmos app chain thesis came from. And we started building at that point with IBC and interoperability. But, I think every cycle we're seeing sort of what worked in the last cycle, and people are trying to compete for that. And I think that this single chain credible neutrality thing that, Kyle, you represent a lot of folks out there who believe this, and we here in Cosmos are by far the minority on this. So totally willing to admit that. But I think that what is much more likely is we see this world with many, many chains, which is what we've seen over and over again throughout the past.
Yeah.